Dr. Tine Rassalle, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to come and walk through a video we got sent on some archaeological evidence that supports, confirms, or proves, depending on who you talk to, the Bible. You are going to be teaching a new class on the archaeology of the Hebrew Bible here coming up for the religion department. The link's down in the description. You can go and join that class now. It's going to be starting. And so, given this class that you're teaching, I thought you could be a great voice to help unpack the claims that we're going to have in this video. So thank you so much for coming to join us today.
No, thank you for having me. Yes, you are correct. This Thursday, we are starting an 8-week class on archaeology and the Hebrew Bible, which I'm really excited for. I am a biblical archaeologist myself, so this is right up my alley. So if you are interested in archaeology and the Hebrew Bible at all, please join us on Thursday. But for now, we're starting with this video, I believe.
We're going to start here because this is a person, I don't think he would claim to be an archaeologist, but many people do try to use archaeology, especially in relationship to the Bible, sometimes fairly and sometimes improperly. Sometimes there are stretches that happen. And so I'm interested to hear your perspective on some of the claims that get made by this creator. So let's just start at the top and see where we end up.
Sounds good.
Archaeology alone is very strong evidence that we can trust the Bible. Critics at one time said Abraham did not exist, and if he did, he didn't live in Ur of the Chaldees because we have never found it until they dug up Ur of the Chaldees in the early 1920s.
Okay, stop. I find this a very interesting connection he makes between having the evidence for a city, a place to exist, and then connecting this with a historical, mythological figure that is also supposed to have existed at that time. I want to say the archaeology of the Hebrew Bible is not out there to prove or disprove biblical facts, right? It is there to observe, to excavate and see what we had, what existed, and then to take conclusions from there, right? You're not supposed to already go into the field with a certain goal, a certain hope in mind of what you're going to find, either to prove, give evidence for the biblical story, or to debunk it, the other side, right? And so here in this example, I find it really weird that he is using the evidence of, yes, Ur existed as a city, as a Mesopotamian city, and then Abraham also lived and came for there, and this is evidence of that fact, right?
Yeah.
I always compare it to, for example, reading a Harry Potter book. Harry Potter mentions a lot of places around. There's London, there's King's Crossing Station. These places exist, but that doesn't mean that Harry Potter existed or that magic is real, right? These are just fictional stories set in a historical context. And so finding the context does not automatically prove that the people who lived there actually were historical figures, right? And the second problem with this statement is that if we would believe that Abraham was a historical figure who lived, pre-Exodus, then we would date Abraham somewhere in the 2nd millennium BCE, right? Well, we know that the Chaldeans only arose as a sedentary settlement. They were tribal countries, nomadic tribes before that, only settled down in the Neo-Babylonian period, which is after the 9th century BCE. So we're mixing up some anachronistic details here where we are placing a much older story in a much more modern context, which of course doesn't add up with the facts as we would have them in the Bible.
Yeah, so even if you're wanting to try to use this site, you're still having a problem by it being out of sync in the timeline. Can I ask too, in the setup that he had, that first line, that archaeology alone is very strong evidence that we can trust the Bible. You're talking here about when you go to excavate. You're not seeking to prove or to disprove. When you talk to people about your experiences or the finds or what exists in archaeology, do you feel like that trust aspect is kind of just, in a way, a lot of people are thinking about this with maybe not really realizing it or not vocalizing it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, many people are interested in biblical archaeology. Whenever I mention it to anyone at the airport, everyone always has questions, right? Everyone thinks about religion at some point in their life. And for most people in the Western world, that means Christianity or Judaism, which means they're thinking about the biblical world, right? But a lot of people only have a superficial knowledge of the biblical text. They don't actually go deeper into the text and look up where all these places are, if they match up on a timeline. And it's only when you're really delving into a specific detail that you start seeing the problems around it, that they don't line up, or that there are discrepancies between different parts of the Bible. So if you start thinking about it deeper, you have to come up with other ideas, hypotheses, opinions for these discrepancies or for these facts that don't add up, right?
Yeah, but that's a lot of hard work
Yes.
that a lot of people don't necessarily want to do. But the things you should do and the things you can do if you sign up for the class Archaeology of the Hebrew Bible. I want to turn you to the next one in their sequence because it's one of those names that everybody seems to know and to love.
Sodom and Gomorrah dug up 70 cities in the Jordan Valley and found that it was lush and thriving, just like the Bible said. And critics of the Bible said,
So I don't understand the statement at all. His conclusion doesn't correlate with his introduction, right? He says, we have evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah because we excavated many sites and the sites showed that it was fertile there at some point. What does that have to do with anything? We know that Jordan or the Middle East was much more fertile at some point. I have excavated it in Jordan and we found seashells, although we were in the middle of the desert, because at some point there was a sea there. And so, climate changes, geography changes, climate changes. It could have been that it used to be warm and or more humid, and now it is not. But I don't see the correlation with Sodom and Gomorrah at all.
And it's an odd one because he doesn't even go the path that I thought he would. As soon as he said the name, I expected him to say, oh, archaeologist X has found it's always proof of destruction by fire, or there's some kind of look at this destroyed city. He doesn't even go to that path. He goes a different way, that it's all these fertile cities and 70 of them, like that somehow has a connection. It feels very confused, like the first one, where what's the relationship between the two things? It's just something exists in an area. It seems to be all that's there.
And that is a technique that I very often hear pseudo-archaeologists use when you watch a show like Ancient Aliens. They will have a very deep theory with a lot of jargon and it sounds very impressive. And then they connect it to something that has nothing to do with it. But because they say it with so much confidence, it makes sense until you actually sit down and start mapping it out and you see the problems in their theories.
The problems in the theories can emerge, pretty quickly in a lot of these, especially these internet walkthroughs of, here's a nice truncated list. And if anything's ever too quick and too simple, like when you're moving through things this fast, you're leaving a lot of stuff out because, these 70 cities, well, from when? Like he doesn't talk even about when do these come from? Where are they specific? Like this is all just very vague. Here's some general things I'm going to throw in front of you and we can move along. Not off to a great start.
No.
Not off to a great start.
Not at all.
King David, one of the most famous people in the Bible, they said, we don't think he ever existed. This was a monument stone from a Syrian king in 900 BC, celebrating his victory over the house of David.
Okay, stop. So this is a really good example because he is taking something that is actual evidence. So we do have this stele. It's called the Tel Dan Stele, and it's the oldest stone inscription that mentions the house of David from the Bible. And the house of David basically means the dynasty of David. We're not talking about a literal house where he lived in, right? We're talking about the house where he was the first father and then the children in the lineage. That is the house of David. And so we don't have extra biblical evidence for David having ever existed. He could have been a real historical figure, or he could have been a mythological figure, or in my opinion, probably a mix of both, right? He probably was a very important leader, perhaps a king, onto which historical, mythological, legendary stories have all been mapped onto, kind of like the King Arthur story, right? Mm-hmm. Every legendary hero story gets then correlated with David because he was such an important figure, right? So we do kind of know that this David existed because of this description and a couple of other ones. But that still doesn't prove anything of that he made Jerusalem his capital, that he was the king of a giant country with millions of people, right? We just know that there was a house of David at some point. This Tel Dan Stele is also from 200, 300 years after David would have supposed to live. So it's not really reflecting David at all. It's talking about hundreds of years later, about his heirs that are still living, not about the king himself.
And this feels like one of the ones that can be so misleading in the way they use it. Because unlike some of the ones that came before, where you're like, well, what are you even talking about? Here they can point to a solid thing and they're like, look at this stone. It has words in it. And one of these words is this name, which if you're trying to do some checklists and coming from different positions, depending on what your background is, you might go, okay, well, that feels then, yeah, that's a thing. That's a real thing you can see and you can touch, and that must then support this. But all of that context that you need for
it's
what is
House the context, right? It's always the context that makes it come alive or debunks it in this instance.
Yeah, this one is always one when it shows up in a list that irks me a lot, because it is a great thing. It can tell us information in different ways, but about what these people want it to say. When you use it in this way, you're like, but that's not what it says, and you're ignoring what it can tell us.
It's also specifically about biblical archaeology, right? If you would find that in any other kind of, medieval archaeology or prehistorical archaeology, we would look at the object and inscription itself and then start thinking about, who is this David? What is a house? Where could a dynasty would have lived? Well, in biblical archaeology, if a name is mentioned in the Bible and then also in an inscription, they must have been the same thing, right? They must correlate.
Yeah, it's an odd framework that you're right, does get abused, let's say, in this particular context, and we can run right into another name that gets the same kind of thing.
We're digging in Caesarea, and they found these big old steps at a Roman palace, and right on the front of one of these stones was the name Pontius Pilate.
Exactly the same thing, right? The fact that Pontius Pilate existed is not, no one is arguing that, right? We know that he was a Roman governor. We know when his reign existed. We know that he was in Judea. So finding a stone with his name on it, since he was such an important political figure, is not surprising. But again, how is that connected to Jesus is what I assume that he is mentioning or hoping for, that we would connect this to the whole passion story, and that this gives evidence for that story to be real with every detail as the Bible is explaining it, while this is just supportive evidence for history, right? Nothing more.
Not a lot more than just that.
The side of this box, it says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus.
Yes. So this is one of the most contested, as you probably know, objects of the last couple of decades that have come out of biblical archaeology. So this is an ossuary, or a stone box, the box in which people, after someone passed away and the body disintegrates, they would take the bones and then put them in a little box and then write sometimes on the outside of it who is in that box, right? Which person's body is entombed in here. And in this particular case, they found a ossuary box that says this belongs to James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Yeshua, Jesus. And of course, if you are a Christian or a Jew, you immediately think of Jesus and his father Joseph. And could this have been the ossuary of the brother of Jesus himself, right? There have been many controversies around this. There was a lawsuit, for example, that claimed that this ossuary box was a forgery, a modern fake, and that lawsuit lasted forever. But people were doing research on the inscription itself. Is it an ancient inscription? Is it the modern one? Can you see patina still in there to show that it was ancient or not? In the end, the person who came up with this object, who claimed to have found it, was acquitted. The court said this is not a modern forgery, but we are still debating that. But even if it is ancient, the problem is that these names are so they are often used so often in that society at that time. These are very common names, that there could have been many, many cases of a James, brother of Joshua. It would be the same as finding an ossuary now that says John, the son of Michael, brother of Ben. I mean, half of US is called James, Michael, or Ben. And so there's been a very interesting documentary made about this specific case that I would recommend people to watch if you're interested, where they are going over all of these theories and asking people how statistically likely it is to find a tomb or a ossuary box just from that Jesus, etc., which makes it more or less unlikely that this would be the actual ossuary of Jesus' brother.
Well, in all three of these last ones, they draw on that same, here is a name, and I have a name I want to connect that to. And for whatever reason, it can only be that name. And it must then support, as you've said, everything that builds around that name in that tradition, ignoring the context, archaeological or historical, that has to go with those kinds of things. As you prep for your class, and for someone who's watching through this and thinking, I have heard some things like this before, or I have seen these types of videos, I was raised maybe in a context where I was told this type of information, how do you start to walk through this in the class for unpacking, like the things people need to identify when they start to think about these artifacts, the questions they should ask? Where do you start in a class like this?
Yeah, so our very first class will be on literal that. What is biblical archaeology? What has been the history of biblical archaeology from the 19th century, where they were literally, digging with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the others, as they often say, until the modern time period where we're using more and more scientific techniques. We've gone to different thoughts, ideas, philosophical schools of how archaeology should be interpreted. So we're going over all of that in the first class, also showing that archaeology is not a specific science, right? We always have to make educated guesses. We have hypotheses, then we debate among scholars. We change our point of view. New evidence come up. We constantly change our ideas, sometimes in small details, about what really happens in the Hebrew Bible time periods. And so we're going to go over all of that in the first class, what objects you can use, what are layers, what are strata, to really understand how do we get to the information, how do we get to the facts that I am teaching in class, where do these come from? They do not just fall from the sky, right? There's a scientific methodology behind getting evidence, behind deducing theories and ideas from artifacts and objects that we are going to start the class with, before we then move on to a chronological overview of the Hebrew Bible, starting with the Bronze Age, the Exodus story, going over the Iron Age, the Persian period, the Hellenistic periods, and then we end with the Roman period, where we get more synagogues and such after the destruction of the temple. So that is the kind of the timeline of these 8 classes.
It sounds like a whirlwind of pleasurable material to move through. So if you are interested, if you're watching this when this comes out, you're in luck. You can join the sessions live as they happen. There's a link down in the description. It's going to be starting on October 16th. If you found this in the future and you're thinking, I am out of luck, you're not out of luck, because you can still go and watch replays of them. So go either way. When you're seeing this when this comes out, good. If you're in the future, nice to see you. You can still go and join and get this insight, because we got to watch his last line, because I think that ties in very well with where he lands here in a phrase that you'll hear a lot in these kinds of videos.
There have been over 25,000 discoveries archaeologically that relate to the Bible, and never has a single one of them proven the Bible to be wrong.
So if you're thinking to yourself, surely that can't be right. Yeah, because what does it mean for archaeology to prove the Bible to be wrong? In the same way, I think we have to say, can it prove the Bible to be right? It doesn't prove or disprove as you're going through these things, right?
Right. Yes, it always reminds me of those ancient alien theories where they say, could it have happened that aliens visit us? I'm like, well, yes, it could have happened. If you phrase it like that, anything is possible. We could be surrounded by vampires and zombies. Who knows? Anything is possible. But we have to have a little bit more concrete physical proof before we can say statements like that. And I don't know if he's never watched a video or read an article on biblical archaeology to make such a statement, because I mean, there's plenty of evidence for things that do not correlate with the Hebrew Bible at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and where do you get 25,000 from? What are you counting? What are you?
I mean,
what's
pottery
your
shards, then you can say we
Yeah.
have 5 million pieces of evidence that there was
Where
an
that-
Iron Age.
where that number comes from? It feels like one of those claims to authority because you're like, yeah, look at all these numbers, and yet I'm going to ignore things like, well, let's not look at that site and what time the destruction might have happened there, and that doesn't. No, we don't need to look there, and maybe let's not look over here either.
Right.
If you are, however, interested in looking in those places, you should sign up for the class. I think you are really going to enjoy it. Dr. Rassalle, I think this is a wonderful addition to the needs of the world and the internet who are interested in the Bible and archaeology and ancient history and the broader world and need some access to good and reliable information. So thank you so much for doing this class for everyone.
Thank you. I will be glad to have everyone who is interested.
Well, for this week, that's all we're going to leave it there. A little bit to mull over and some more available for you. Go sign up. But for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.